cases, it creates new problems. And you mentioned earlier about other countries. You and the president have both said, well, other countries are reopening. So let's look at the statistics there if we can. Let's put them up on the screen. Germany reported 378 new cases on Friday. Denmark, 30. Norway, 11. Meanwhile, the U.S. reported 68,226 new cases on Friday. Question, is it really fair? Is it reasonable to compare the situation in countries that have 20 new cases in a day with a country that has 68,000 new cases in a day?
Well, we're talking about schools and other countries' experiences with reopening schools, and it has been shown to be very successful. Kids have gone back to learning environments and have done so safely and healthily. But schools happen in an environment.
If there's 30 cases in a state and in a country, that's very different than a place where it's out of control and there are 70,000 new cases in a day.
And we're not talking about places where it's, quote, out of control. We're talking about the rule, not the exception. And where there are hot spots in the future, in the fall, of course, that has to be dealt with differently. And I would reference Miami-Dade County, which has a very robust continuity of learning plan that was put into place in anticipation of hurricanes, but it's very appropriate here. The state of Florida has said in the fall, parents and students need to be able to count on a 5-day-a-week in-person school situation.
I have one last question, Secretary DeVos, because both you and the president have threatened to cut off funding for school systems that don't open fully in the fall. Here you are.
If schools aren't going to reopen again, that's breaking that promise. And so why should they receive funds for something they're not going to do?
And President Trump tweeted Friday, schools must be open in the fall. If not open, why would the federal government give funding? It won't. Two quick questions, and I need a quick answer, if I can, from you, Secretary DeVos. One, under what authority are you and the president going to unilaterally cut off funding, the funding that's been approved from Congress, and most of the money goes to disadvantaged students or students with disabilities? And secondly, isn't cutting off funding exactly the wrong answer? Don't you want to spend more money to make schools safer, whether it's with plastic shields or health checks, various other systems? Doesn't it make more sense to increase funding for schools where it's unsafe rather than cut off funding?
Look, American investment in education is a promise to students and their families. If schools aren't going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds. Then give it to the families to decide to go to a school that is going to meet that promise.
Well, you can't do that. I mean, I know you guys support vouchers, and I know you support vouchers, and that's a reasonable argument, but you can't do that unilaterally. You have to do that through Congress.
Well, we're looking at all the options because it's a promise to the American people, to students and their families, and we want to make sure that promise is followed through on.
You know you're on the wrong track when even Fox News is calling you out for being so dangerously off base with regard to school reopenings. This is Chris Wallace calling out Education Secretary Betsy DeVos for using countries like Germany, Denmark, and Norway as benchmarks for school reopenings when our cases in the U.S. are light years higher than theirs are. Right off the bat, DeVos gives a bad faith answer. When Wallace asks if it's reasonable to compare the US to any of these countries, she dissembles by saying that we're talking about schools, as if to separate school reopenings with the countries that they're located in. What she seems to be missing here is that schools are in countries. And so if a school is in a country with 20 new cases, it's going to be leagues different than a school in a country with 68,000 new cases. Schools aren't separate ecosystems. They don't exist on a separate plane. The people who enter schools also live in society. And if that society is plagued with tens of thousands of new cases every single day, then obviously it's going to have an impact on the school. And the fact that that's not obvious to the education secretary of all people is pretty embarrassing. She goes on to try and save face by claiming that she's not talking about the hot spots, just the other places. But just so we're clear, let's take a look at a map of the US where cases are going up. This way we know which are the hot spots to avoid. The spots in red are where cases are going up, and the spots in blue are where the cases are going down. So I guess if we're going to isolate hot spots, then the only places we have to avoid are Arizona, Alabama, Alaska, California, Florida, Colorado, Texas, Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, South Carolina, Michigan, Louisiana, Maryland, Virginia, Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana, Minnesota, Washington, Wisconsin, Iowa, Utah, Missouri, Nevada, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Kansas, New Mexico, Delaware, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Idaho, Puerto Rico, North Dakota, West Virginia, Montana, Hawaii, and the Virgin Islands. Perfect. She even goes on to reference the fact that Florida has said that in the fall, parents and students need to be able to count on a 5-day-a-week in-person school situation. And I'm just going to go out on a limb here and suggest that maybe Florida isn't the state we turn to for advice here. And that's because Florida has just broken yet another single-day record for coronavirus cases, with 15,300 cases reported just today. That is more than any other state at any point in the outbreak. Florida is effectively the world's case study in what not to do during a pandemic, led, of course, by Republicans like Governor Ron DeSantis, whose priority was making sure that all of the beaches and bars and restaurants stayed open for spring break. He was hailed by the White House, whose position was also to keep everything open. You could not have a clearer indication of the dangers of poor leadership than Trump and DeSantis. And the fact that DeVos is deferring to these people, the people who have been responsible for horribly misguided policies that have already left over 130,000 Americans dead and are responsible for tens and hundreds of thousands of new cases every single day, is proof that they're not learning. They're not learning from their mistakes. And if they haven't learned yet, with all of the loss and devastation that we've already suffered, then they're never going to learn. And so the last thing that should be happening here is that those people should be making decisions impacting the lives of children, because those people's only priority is money and getting the economy back up and running so that Trump has a talking point for the November election. I'd challenge you to find a single American parent who's more concerned with the stock market than their own child's life. And finally, Chris Wallace asks her about her and Trump's threats to withhold funding to schools that don't succumb to the will of herself and the president, pointing out that we should be adding funding rather than ripping it away. And it's telling that her only answer here is to advocate for school choice. To be clear, DeVos' husband owns and operates a charter school, and her personal goal has always been defunding public schools so that for-profit charter schools with little oversight and accountability can get their hands on that funding. And it should speak volumes that even now, in the middle of a pandemic where 130,000 Americans have died, where more than 3 million Americans have been infected, her priority is still advancing her personal agenda that would only make her own family richer. So DeVos can continue her cable news circuit to try and muddy the waters with regard to school reopenings, but what's happening here is obvious. She's only in this to help herself and the president, while the safety of American school children isn't even on her radar. And don't forget to listen to my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, where I'll take a deep dive into the biggest issues of the week and interview major players in the world of politics, like Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Beto O'Rourke, Eric Swalwell, Katie Porter, and many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.